Is the Shroud of Turin a miracle or a hoax? I'm the host. This program is brought to you by a university and made possible by our patrons. Join them today at our support page. It's a piece of linen cloth bearing the faint image of a crucified man. To many people, this is the burial shroud of Jesus Christ, a physical link to the Savior that has survived for 2 millennia. Others see it as nothing more than a cleverly painted medieval forgery, perhaps even a scam. That's right. Even if it is a fake, it's still pretty cool. And maybe it's both. Maybe it is a miracle and a hoax at the same time. So what is the deal with the Shroud of Turin? In this video, we try to settle once and for all whether it's a biblical relic or an elaborate fraud. But first, let's explore how this mystery began. The Shroud of Turin is a linen cloth bearing the faint image of a crucified man. Today it is kept in a silver case inside the royal chapel at the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. Most Christians believe that it was wrapped around Jesus after his crucifixion, and that somehow the imprint of his face was transferred onto the cloth. However, the earliest record we have of the shroud comes from a letter written in 1354 by an English clergyman named Robert of Tyranny. He writes of a sacred cloth in the chapel of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem that was used to wrap Christ's body. The cloth apparently had the actual image of Christ, though it wasn't called the Shroud of Turin. It was simply known as the Very Holy Cloth. In 1453, the cloth was moved to Liry, France, where it remained until 1578. At some point during the 16th century, the name Shroud of Turin came into use. Then in 1908, the cloth was sold to the House of Savoy, the royal family of Italy, who donated it to the cathedral in Turin. So what makes the Shroud of Turin so special? Why do millions of people around the world still debate over its authenticity? One reason is that the cloth seems to fit perfectly with the biblical account of Jesus' death and resurrection. According to the Gospels, he was scourged, crowned with thorns, and crucified. The shroud bears faint marks of these wounds. Another reason is that the Shroud of Turin contains some mysterious details that are difficult to explain. Some of these have led people to believe that the shroud is actually a genuine relic from the time of Christ. For example, when the shroud was scientifically analyzed in the late 20th century, it was discovered that the image contained unique 3D information. It's like a 3D photo where your eyes can see the depth of the image, but only from certain angles. Today, the shroud is one of only a few ancient artifacts that are known to contain this type of 3D information. The others are Buddhist prayer wheels from Tibet, which were created much later. Scientists have suggested that this 3D effect may have been created using a technique known as holography, but they don't know for sure. Another curious detail about the shroud is that according to some studies, it contains pollen from plants that grow naturally only in Jerusalem and the surrounding area. If the shroud really is a medieval forgery, it seems strange that whoever made it went to such lengths to gather authentic Middle Eastern pollen. Of course, it's possible that someone could have gathered the pollen themselves and sprinkled it onto the cloth, but that would seem pointless. Forensic analysis of the bloodstains on the shroud also lends credence to its authenticity. Researchers found that the blood was most likely the real thing, type AB, with traces of bilirubin, which is produced by the liver and appears in the blood of people who have suffered traumatic injuries. But what about those who think the shroud is a fake? What evidence do they have? The main piece of evidence that led people to conclude that the shroud is a medieval forgery, rather than a biblical relic, comes from carbon-14 dating tests carried out by 3 different labs in 1988. All 3 tests came to the same conclusion. The shroud was created sometime between 1260 and 1390 AD, which means it couldn't possibly be the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. It seems that the medieval forgers did a good job making their creation look old. However, critics of the carbon dating tests have pointed out that the sample taken from the shroud may have been a badly repaired section of the cloth. It's one that had been exposed to the elements for hundreds of years. They also suggest that the sample may have been contaminated by something organic, perhaps dirt or bacteria, which would have skewed the results. Other critics claim that the shroud isn't a painting at all, but rather an early form of photography. Proponents of this theory suggest that the image was created when an unknown source of radiation caused the linen fibers to darken. This radiation could have come from the resurrection. But just as this theory requires us to suspend disbelief in the carbon dating tests, finally, there are those who believe that the Shroud of Turin is neither a hoax nor a relic, but rather a combination of the two. The idea is that, while the cloth is medieval, it's not a forgery. Instead, it was created by a natural phenomenon that occurred sometime after Jesus died, perhaps radiation from the resurrection or chemical reactions caused by exposure to his blood. To understand why this mystery has captivated people for so long, it helps to know a bit about the history of the shroud. As mentioned earlier, the first written reference to the shroud dates back to the year 1354. However, legend has it that the shroud was brought to Europe from the Middle East in the 11th century. Apparently it was carried to Edessa, a city in modern-day Turkey, by a merchant ship. Over the years, the shroud became known as the Edessa cloth. Eventually it came into the possession of the Knights Templar, a holy order founded in the 12th century to protect pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land. According to legend, they stole it from a church in Jerusalem. In the mid-14th century, the shroud ended up in Liéry, France, where it remained for several hundred years. It was only in the 20th century that it was moved to Turin. So why did the medieval church bother with this silly game? There are a few possible motives. First of all, people were willing to pay good money to see holy relics, which meant that there was a lot of money to be made by creating convincing fakes. Plus, the church needed all the help it could get. During the Middle Ages, pilgrimages to the Holy Land were dangerous. Bandits and enemies of the church lurked around every corner. So having a holy relic in Europe gave people a legitimate excuse to stay home. Finally, the church desperately needed something to believe in. After all, the Black Death had killed nearly half of Europe's population. A little hope never hurt anyone. Today, the Shroud of Turin is still causing controversy. Last year, a group of scientists claimed that DNA testing revealed the shroud was a burial cloth used for encasing a dead man who had wounds consistent with crucifixion. However, the head of the Vatican Museums quickly dismissed these claims as irrelevant. The church has not yet officially declared the shroud authentic, but it does venerate it as a holy relic. But what about the science? Can we ever hope to solve this mystery? New dating methods have been proposed, as well as new imaging techniques that will allow us to study the shroud in greater detail than ever before. Who knows what secrets it's hiding? Perhaps one day we'll find out for sure whether it's a miracle or a hoax. Or maybe the truth will continue to elude us, leaving the shroud forever shrouded in mystery. What do you think? Is the Shroud of Turin a biblical relic or a medieval forgery? Let me know in the comments below. Many thanks to our supporters, especially those of you in Tier 4 and above. Thanks for watching. See you next week.